Well, good evening. It's very nice to see all of you, and it's a great honor to start this speaker series on globalization. I have a very strong and long-term relationship with iHouse. It's not exactly a personal relationship, but it is, in a sense, personal, because the person from whom I learned economics and politics and the relationship between economics and politics and sociology at Harvard, John Kenneth Galbraith, actually lived here at iHouse. And he used to tell me about it, and he was infatuated with Berkeley. His family, he's no longer with us, after he died, his family bequeathed to me his graduation gown, his robe. Now, some of you may not know this, but John Kenneth Galbraith was about 6'8". I'm not exaggerating. He was, I think, 6'8". So the gown doesn't fit exactly, but I had it just last year. I had it hemmed, and it's just perfect. But I actually have now 2 gowns. That's my connection to iHouse. I thought I'd talk about half an hour and then leave the rest of the time up for questions, if that's okay, because I learn much more from your questions, and I don't learn anything from me. So here is what I have to say, and it really concerns globalization, and I entitled this lecture Globaloney, because I wanted to talk about the mythologies of globalization. You see, if we don't get the problem right, we're not going to get the solutions right. 90%, if not 95% of the problem in public policy making has to do with defining the problem correctly. And with regard to things global, or this term globalization, we continually define the problem weirdly, wrongly, sometimes outrageously. And so tonight, hopefully, I'm going to clear away some of the dust and try to define it accurately. Globalization is one of those rare terms in public life to have gone directly from obscurity to meaninglessness without any intervening period of coherence. I mean, when I was an undergraduate and a graduate student, people didn't talk about globalization. They talked about global trade or direct investment. They talked about immigration. They talked about portfolio investment. They talked a little bit about climate, although not nearly enough. But we didn't really talk about globalization. And it wasn't until the 1980s that we began to talk about globalization in terms of competitiveness. Do you remember that? Those were the days when Japan was challenging the preeminence of the United States. Everybody was very frightened of Japan. Japan was destined, said people like Ezra Vogel of Harvard, destined was going to be number one. It was almost number one. It would displace the United States. It would take over all of advanced technologies, all of advanced manufacturing, leaving us to a kind of second-class status, and we better be careful. And there were calls. I mean, I remember the intensity of the concern about Japan. The notion that the United States' competitiveness depends on, as we understood it in the 1980s, a kind of race to preeminence between the United States and another country, or, to put it more specifically, between the United States companies that are here, American companies and foreign companies, is itself a mythology. It is the first mythology of globalization. And it is a very dangerous mythology. You even hear it today. Our president, Barack Obama, not that long ago, I think it was about 3 months ago, he gave a speech about the economy and about the goals for the economy, in which he said that the goal for the United States was to actually, he didn't use the word preeminent, but he used words, and I didn't bring them with me, but some of you remember that speech. He talked about making sure the United States stayed ahead of other countries. And it was not Japan that people heard when he said that. It was, obviously, China. We have to maintain our own preeminence. We. He used a lot of pronouns. And every time you hear somebody talking about globalization using the collective pronoun we or us, watch your wallets. Because it's not clear who is us. The president appointed a jobs council about a year ago to advise him on jobs. And he's going to be giving a major address next Thursday on jobs. He made the chair of that jobs council somebody who I think is a very reasonable and seems to be a very thoughtful man, who happens to be the CEO of General Electric. Now, I have nothing against General Electric. I do have a few things against it, but I don't have a lot of big things against General Electric, and I certainly have nothing personally against the chairman and CEO of General Electric. But the assumption that the CEO of General Electric and that General Electric in general represented American competitiveness or was American was itself a kind of leap of logic, a leap of faith, a kind of very unclear leap of faith. Is General Electric us? Is IBM us? Is ExxonMobil us? Well, they may be headquartered in the United States, but they are global companies. They are creating more jobs abroad now than they are in the United States. Their sales abroad are growing faster than are their sales in the United States. Many of them are making more money abroad than in the United States. Most of them are keeping that money abroad rather than bringing it back to the United States. In almost every respect, they are and act identical to any other global company with global shareholders whose shares values have to be maximized. Why do we assume that a company headquartered in the United States is the essence of America in the sense that we have got to make sure that they predominate over countries who are headquartered in other countries who are utilizing many of the same strategies and tactics and buying and selling and doing all of the things that they do all the way around the world to exactly the same extent. This issue actually came to my attention very dramatically when I was Secretary of Labor, because the old family car died, and I was delegated to find a new one. And I went one weekend to a showroom. I think it was a Toyota showroom. And I found a car that perfectly met our family's needs. And I persuaded everybody else in my immediate household that was the case. And then I told one of my assistants at the Labor Department that I was on the verge of buying a new car. And he said, well, that's wonderful. What kind? And I said, Toyota. And he said, Mr. Secretary, and he said it very tactfully, let me remind you, you are Secretary of Labor of the United States. And it might not be a good idea to buy a Toyota, not that Toyotas are necessarily bad. I immediately saw the wisdom of his ways, this young man. And the next weekend, I went to a Ford showroom, and I found a car that was almost as good. But I remember I asked the Ford dealer, because I wanted to make sure that I was not committing a real political, scandalous faux pas. I asked the Ford dealer, I said, can you please tell me what car made here in the United States by American workers? And he looked at me for a long instant, trying to decide, was I one of those? Or was I one of those? And finally he looked up with a smile and said, which would you prefer? But you see my point. I mean, everything is made everywhere. domestic content is itself difficult to discern and difficult to determine. Japanese cars are made here, Fords are made all over. I just did, and I have to confess to you here, last weekend I did buy a new car. I'm not going to tell you what kind of car, but I did check, and most of it, that is 62% of it, was made in the United States. Thank you. So let me just clear the air, and I'll come back to this. Myth number one is that there is something called American competitiveness, that it's kind of a zero-sum game, and that it's our companies against their companies. Mythology number two also gets us into trouble repeatedly, especially now, is the idea that somehow we are losing jobs. Indeed, the current terrible high unemployment is somehow due to other countries, particularly China or countries in Latin America, that somehow they've taken jobs from us. And we get this kind of anger, and you feel it. I mean, the economy right now is obviously terrible. 25 million Americans who are looking for full-time work, an economy that is barely growing. But on the jobs front, I get every day emails, and I hear from people who say what we need to do is get those foreigners to play this game fairer. We've got to get China to revalue its currencies. And on and on and on. And if all of these other countries did what they should be doing, we would not have the jobs crisis we do have. Well, that also is both mythological and magical thinking. It is dangerous thinking. The reason we have a jobs crisis in the United States is not because of them. The reason we have a jobs crisis in the United States is because we have insufficient aggregate demand here in the United States. Consumers here in the United States are 70%. That is, their spending constitutes 70% of gross domestic product. If consumers here are scared or unable to spend, as they are now, they're scared of losing their jobs, their wages, that is, the median wage, continues to drop. It has dropped since 2001. The value of their homes, the major asset that most people have, not their portfolios, it's their homes that's the major asset of most Americans. The major asset has dropped 33% since 2006. 1/4 of Americans are underwater in terms of owing more on their homes than their homes are worth. Given all of that, and given the possibility of job loss, and the fact that almost everyone knows somebody who has lost their jobs, consumers are not willing, understandably, rationally, they are not willing to spend enough to keep the economy going. Businesses don't need tax cuts. Businesses don't need more money. American businesses right now are sitting on $2 trillion of cash. They could afford to expand and create jobs if they wanted to, but they don't want to. Why do they not want to? Because nobody in their right mind, no business in its right sensibility, would create more jobs and expand without customers. And so the private sector, customers and businesses, are holding back. And because they are holding back, we are in a vicious cycle. How do we get out of the vicious cycle? Not by blaming foreigners, but by doing what we have done in the last 8 recessions. Indeed, we did it even in the Great Depression, and it was called World War II. I'm not suggesting we have a war. I'm talking about government spending. That is, the crisis we have immediately before us is a crisis of aggregate demand. And the problem is not foreigners, the problem is not globalization, the problem is that we need right now to spend more in order to get demand back, and also to get growth back, and get jobs back. And people who are worried about the debt, that's another, we don't have time to get into all of these wonderful issues, but I will in your question period. Don't even understand that it's not debt, it's the ratio of the debt to the GDP that is worrisome. And if we don't start growing, that ratio of debt to GDP is going to get worse and worse and worse. I can look at your eyes and I say the ratio of debt to GDP and your eyes glaze over. It's as if I'm not even, you're not even here any longer. Goodbye. But you see how, again, back to my theme, defining the problem wrong gets us into very dangerous places. A third related mythology with regard to globalization is that the long-term loss of jobs in the United States, the loss of good jobs, the loss of manufacturing jobs, the displacement of workers in America is really due to the Mexicans or the Latin Americans or the Chinese or the Indians or all of these other countries that are taking our jobs. In other words, this is a slightly more refined version of myth number 2. This mythology 3 that I'm giving you has certainly a major grain of truth to it. It's not exactly that they are taking away jobs permanently, because before the Great Recession, unemployment was about 5.5% or 6%. When I was labor secretary, Bill Clinton, under his the economy generated 20 million net new jobs. We got unemployment down to 4%. I was the Secretary of Labor when that happened. I was responsible for all of that. No, I wasn't responsible. I was Secretary of Labor, but I was not responsible. But my point is that to think of globalization as somehow reducing the number of jobs in the United States is also mythological. The globalization has been more subtle with regard to jobs. It hasn't reduced the number. It has changed the composition of jobs in the United States. But before we condemn globalization entirely for that change in composition, and by the way, that change in composition does have a lot to do with the decline of manufacturing jobs, the decline of high-wage jobs, the decline of a lot of jobs valued very much that were important jobs, that were unionized jobs, many of them. But before we condemn globalization for that solely, let's be clear. Many of those jobs were lost not to globalization, but to technology, to automation. You remember we used to have bank tellers? Does anybody remember bank tellers? I tell my students, there was a time, they don't believe it, there was a time where you could not get money out of a bank or put money into a bank without talking to a person. And they think that's ridiculous. There had to be ATMs. What did you do in the Stone Age? Or how many of you remember telephone operators? Yes, my students don't. I say, what do you think the O was for on a telephone? But there's not an O there anymore anyway. I mean, there's a 0, but it's not the old O for operator. I remember, well, you remember when there were service station attendants. Anybody here remember service station? How many of you, just to test the waters here? Wait, you remember? All of you remember. How many of you, okay, wait. How many of you remember service station attendants who wore uniforms? This is a very old audience. Well, before I went to become Secretary of Labor, I drove down to the local service station, where I lived in Massachusetts, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I rolled down the window, and somebody asked me if I wanted to have my oil changed, and I knew him. He was George, and there was another person there, Harry, and we used to talk all the time, and there were other people there, and there was a kind of a little mini social occasion in my community, the service station attendants. And now, well, in fact, it happened very quickly. About 5 or 6 years later, when I came back from Washington, I got in my car and went down, and there was nobody there at all. Nobody. It was absolutely, it was weird. It was, what happened to these people? They were gone. I couldn't, I think somebody might have been behind a glass window, but I am not sure. Oh, by the way, you know that you are no longer in the president's cabinet when you get in the back seat of your car and there's nobody in the front seat. It took a while for me to adjust to this new reality. About, sitting back there, I knew something was wrong. But so here's the question. What happened to all of the service station attendants or the telephone operators or the bank tellers? And by the way, if you look in a modern factory today, a modern manufacturing facility, do you see the old assembly line? Chances are you don't. What you see in a modern, a brand new factory, and there are new factories that are opening up in the United States, what you see in these new factories is more likely to be numerically controlled machine tools, robotics. In fact, I was at the opening of a brand new factory not that long ago in the Midwest. A governor who had attracted the factory with public funds, tax subsidies, asked me to come and be at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. And I went there, and I went into the factory to see all these wonderful jobs that had been created, and I could only count about 12 people. And they were technicians sitting behind computer consoles. And those computer consoles were connected to all the robotics and numerically controlled machine tools, and the assembly line was nowhere in sight. Even China, the latest data I've come across, China is losing manufacturing jobs. How can that be? How can China, the center of world assembly and manufacturing, be losing manufacturing jobs? For the same reason, ultimately, we began technologically, because China is adding more and more technology to its factories. In other words, although globalization is partly responsible for a lot of loss of good jobs in the United States, technology is also responsible for the loss of many of those jobs, including many good factory jobs. Even if we were going to be so unwise as to put an iron curtain around the United States and not trade with anybody, and not try to, and make sure we didn't lose any jobs to the other countries around the world, we would still be losing these good jobs to automation and to advanced technology. So back to my question, what happened to all of these people, the telephone operators, the bank tellers, the service station attendants, the factory workers? Well, many of them are still working. Many of them have gone. Many of them are retired. Some of them are no longer with us, but many of them are still working. They are just working at different kinds of jobs, jobs that entail personal service, that entail personal attention. Retail, restaurant, hotel, hospital, surface transportation, long list. But they tend to be shielded from global competition in the sense that the work can't be done abroad, it's got to be done in person, but more importantly, to many of these jobs, cannot be done by a machine. It has to be done by a person because it entails personal care, personal attention, personal relationship. The problem with these jobs is they don't pay very much, just by virtue of the law of supply and demand. There are many people who want the jobs, and there's not that big a demand. Also, they're not all that productive. They don't come attached to a lot of machinery. They are basically low-wage, low-skilled service jobs. We have a lot of them. We're creating a lot more. look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and you see that's most of what has been created since the Great Recession. We have about 1 million and some odd new jobs that have been created since the Great Recession, since 2008, 2009. Those are mostly, almost entirely, personal service jobs that are low paid. Again, mythology number 3, it's not that globalization is responsible solely for changing the composition of our jobs and consigning so many Americans to low-wage jobs. It's that globalization, in combination with technology, has changed the composition of the workforce. Not the number of jobs, but the composition of the workforce. Which brings me to the final mythology, and then I want to talk about what we should do. The final, number 4 mythology is simply this, that we cannot hope to compete with low-wage nations around the world. That the American workforce has priced themselves out of global competition. That in order to be competitive, American workers have got to settle for much lower wages, lower benefits, and maybe even lower corporate taxes and lower regulations. That, in other words, the only way to compete with low-wage nations around the world is to follow along the same track as those low-wage nations, to essentially take the low road. I've heard it repeatedly, and I hear it more and more. American workers have priced themselves out of global competition. Well, that may sound logical to you until you take a look at other countries, such as, for example, Germany. Germany is still manufacturing. Germany still has a lot of relatively high-wage manufacturing jobs, as well as relatively high-wage non-manufacturing jobs. Since 1985, while the average wage in the United States has grown 6% adjusted for inflation, in Germany, the average wage has grown 30% adjusted for inflation. Now, what's going on? How can the Germans do it? And by the way, they're major exporters. How can Germany do it, and why can't we do it? Before I came to Berkeley 5 years ago, I had my hips replaced. I had to have a hip replacement. I had to have actually a double hip replacement. And I was beginning to talk about these issues of who does what where and third nations and so forth. And I was interested in, well, it was kind of a personal, almost an existential question. I wanted to know where my new hips were made. I mean, it was sort of, who am I? And I went back to the hospital that put my new hips in, and they looked at their records, and my new hips were actually fabricated in Germany. It is precision engineering that Germany has developed and perfected that is the key not only to their competitiveness, but also to their high wages. Germany has invested substantially in education. Math scores of the typical German young person continue to get higher and higher and higher relative to the typical young person in the United States. Also, Germany has very strong trade unions. Trade unions that are strong enough to make sure that as the German economy grows, a large and significant portion of the gains from growth go to average working people. That's good for the economy. It's also good for a lot of the average working people in Germany. In Germany, the top 1% by wealth and by income takes home about 11% of total German national income. Now, that's not all that different from what percentage they took home in 1970. Compare that to the United States. In 1970, in the United States, the top 1% was taking home about 9.5% of total income. In 2007, the top 1% in the United States took home 23.5% of national income. You see, this is not rocket science. It's not easy. I don't want to give you the suggestion or any implication that it is very easy to do, but it has to do with the structure of both the economy and the structure of society and politics. How decisions are made, how the economy is organized, what is invested in, how the fruits of economic growth are shared or not shared. Economics, as a discipline, used to be closely related to politics. Through most of the 19th century, it was called political economy. And there was a very good reason for that, because people understood that politics sets the rules of the game. It sets the rules for the market. Politics and government are essential to understanding what the economic rules are going to be. It was not until 1890 that the great Alfred Marshall wrote his Principles of Economics that took that field out of political economy into another sphere. And the problem is that we forgot the foundation stones. But the foundation stones are even before that, because in the 18th century, it was not even called political economy. It was called moral philosophy. Adam Smith did not call himself an economist. He did not call himself a political economist. He called himself a moral philosopher, because the questions he addressed and the questions other moral philosophers addressed were, what is the nature of a good society? How do we get to a good society? Adam Smith thought that the other book he wrote, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, not The Wealth of Nations, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, was as important, if not more important, than The Wealth of Nations. Because the theory of moral sentiments was all about what connected people to each other, what generated a sense of social cohesion and social solidarity. If nationhood has any meaning at all, if patriotism has any meaning at all, it is not a zero-sum contest in which either they win or we win. At its best, the concept of nationhood is a concept of mutual interdependence, such that we have special responsibility for investing in and ensuring the safety of and well-being of other people around us. We still have a responsibility globally as well, but we have a special responsibility to our fellow members of our society. And that is why when I hear certain people, and I promised myself I would not enter into vulgar partisanship in this august group. But when I hear people, unnamed people, saying that we should not increase taxes on the rich in this country, who are now taking home a higher percentage of total income than they have since before the Great Depression, who are paying lower rates of taxes than they have since the 1970s, who are living better than they have ever lived before, at a time when so many Americans are working so hard and getting fewer services and worse education. And even students trying to come to Berkeley are paying through their nose relative to what they paid before. When I hear that, I get annoyed. One final point, and then your questions. We're living through not only a terrible economy, but also a terrible period of American politics. They too are related. As I said, politics and economics are intricately, intimately related. Because when so many people are so angry and so frustrated and so powerless, when so many people feel that the dice are loaded against them, they are easily vulnerable to demagogues who use the politics of resentment to blame others, foreigners, immigrants, the poor, even the rich, government, union workers, and so forth. That politics of resentment can easily we know, because there are enough historical examples, can get out of hand. I was talking not that long ago on television with somebody of a different political and ideological and philosophical persuasion, and we were having a pretty good debate, I thought. And then at the station break, the producer came on in my ear, you know, we're hooked up, and said, "Be angrier." I said, "I thought we were having a pretty good debate." And she said, "No, you have to be angrier." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because we have millions of people who are surfing through the channels, and they will stop when they see people who are really ferociously beating each other up." I said, "Well, that doesn't sound like the kind of program I want to be involved in." She said, "You're here, be angrier." And I must say, at that point, I lost my temper. Because you see, what is being modeled every day on the media and also in politics and in our society at large is the same anger and frustration and cynicism that so many people are feeling in this stressful economy. And so I say to you, my neighbors, and many of you, my friends, people who are here, I expect many of you share some of the premises and some of the views that I have. I've only shared a few of them with you tonight, but I would suspect that our politics are not all that different. I would ask you to talk with people who disagree with you. Seek out people who disagree with you. Find friends, make friends or relatives in places like Utah and Nebraska and South Dakota and Idaho. Does anybody know anybody in Idaho? Talk to them. In Berkeley, very often I see people protesting all of the money we're spending on the wars, the 2 wars, 3 wars we have abroad, protesting how many children are being sacrificed on the altar of debt reduction and militarism, and the protests are, and they're kind of signs, honk if you agree, and everybody honks. It's Berkeley. And we feel good. But we're not talking to others who disagree. And the only way we have any hope of making major changes in how we view problems in this country is through that kind of dialogue. Winston Churchill once said, "Americans always do the right thing eventually, after they've exhausted all the other alternatives." Thank you very much. And now, we have time.
Test. Unmute.
We have time for your questions, and I went overtime, so we only have about 16 minutes for your questions. But I'm eager for them. And I'll tell you, since we only have 16 minutes, let me urge you to come down, but let me also make a request of you, and that is no speeches and no statements, although I'm really interested in your speeches and statements, but for the sake of time, no speeches, just a question, all right? Okay.
Thank you for making the reference to what is going on in Germany. The developments in Germany that you spoke of were founded in some realization in the 70s that there were serious problems.
I will repeat your question.
Okay. So, if we go back...
And if I can't answer it, I'll come up with a question I can't answer.
In the 70s, realizing these problems. Germany started realizing these problems coming into Germany in the 70s, in the early 70s. What you're seeing now, what you're referring to with respect to education, that is 40 years ago. America is realizing these problems now.
So is that a question?
What is your perspective? How can America accelerate? Well, is there any chance?
I don't think we really have realized the problem with regard to education. we've fallen into these two artificial camps with regard to education in this country. One who call themselves the reformers, and they basically want to privatize education. They want charter schools. They want performance evaluations for teachers, pay for performance, all of that. They want school choice. And then you have others who believe that it's all about getting more money for the schools. And that kind of a debate is the kind of debate I was talking about a moment ago. It is just a debate, a dialogue of the deaf. It is not a debate that goes nowhere. Obviously, we need structural reforms. Obviously, teachers should be accountable. They should, and I know, and I've talked to teachers' unions, they think that there should be pay for performance. They're just nervous about who determines what the performance criteria are, but there should be. But we also need to pay people. The law of supply and demand is not abolished at the schoolhouse door. If we want good people to teach our children, we've got to pay them competitive salaries and wages. Yes.
With the advance in technology, do you envision a time when there will be no full employment, and who will pay the people who are out of work?
Do I envision a time when there will not be full employment, like now? But do I think that that's going to be a new norm? Yeah. Do I think that we're going to be in a period of time for a long time in which there's not full employment? And if so, who will pay people? Who will deal with the social problems? Right. Well, my sincere hope is that that is not a new norm. But what is not being talked about enough, and unfortunately tonight I had time only to allude to it, is that when you have so much of the nation's income and wealth going to the very top, the vast middle class doesn't have enough purchasing power to keep the economy going. Or another way of putting the same thing is that it's fine to talk about stimulus policies or easy money or the Fed doing quantitative easing number 3. These are all fine. They are priming the pump. And in Keynesian terms, you do want to prime the pump. But you've got to have enough water in the well to begin with to make the pump priming exercise work. You've got to be able to turn the pump priming over to consumers. And for some of you in the audience who might be a little bit nervous about me talking about consumers, because it may sound to a Berkeley audience or an audience of some of us like-minded individuals as if I'm saying we want to go back to materialism and filling our houses up with stuff. No. We can consume and do need to consume healthier environments, public health, better education, higher quality life, music, art. All of these non-material goods are still demands on the system that should be there and that can employ people and whom we need to employ. Yes.
Yes, Professor Reich, I relate to you when you say GDP, people's eyes glaze back, because the same thing happens to me when I talk about it with my friends. So I need your help tonight. I'd like you to explain, why is it so important for our economy to get our healthcare costs under control? They're currently at, I believe, 17.5% of GDP. Could you please explain succinctly what that means and why that's important for the future of this country?
Well, the deficit or debt problem in the future is about almost nothing except rising healthcare costs. And those rising healthcare costs, that you're right, getting on to 18% of GDP. 20 years ago, they were about 8% of GDP, and they are rising at a rate that is robbing Americans of the ability to do anything else. I mean, it's the fastest growing item in most family budgets because of not just healthcare costs, but also employers shifting the burden of those costs onto employees in terms of higher deductibles and co-payments and premiums, and Americans simply can't do it. So we have to get control over those costs. But one way of getting control over the costs is to recognize the absurdity of having a system that is based on private, for-profit, often for-profit insurance companies competing. Well, I mean, it's just a waste because these companies compete to get the healthiest individuals and to reduce their costs, like any private companies do, but you end up with an absurd healthcare system in which the companies providing the healthcare are trying to avoid sick people. I mean, I try to explain this to my friends in other countries. We have a healthcare system that is designed to avoid sick people, and they don't quite get it, and neither do I. I think we eventually, hopefully, understand that we have no choice but to create a single-payer Medicare for all system. Yes.
My question relates to seeing this trend in reducing the employment in factories, for example, with increases in technology. Do you see a scenario where the workers at those factories, with increased robotics use, are still able to retain employment in that factory and perhaps lower their hours, but still retain a certain level of wages comparable to before?
Yes.
And if so, do you see any structures of those companies, whether they be employee-owned or unionized or something that would help promote that?
Well, employee ownership does help. The danger there is that employees put all their eggs in one basket, and if a company goes down, that's all their savings. They don't diversify. Unionization also is very useful. It does help, as we see in Germany, as we've seen in our own past. In the 1950s, we had 35% of American workers in unions, private sector workers in unions, and that generated the kind of society in which basically everyone shared in the gains from economic growth to an extent we have not seen since unions have declined to about 7% of private sector. But your point is about technology. That is, what happens when we get to a state in which technology and/or, parenthesis, globalization, eventually makes work unnecessary? Maybe it's a little flavor of the other question I had. There's no reason to get to that point. There's no finite limit to the needs that human beings have, nor is there a finite limit to the ingenuity of the human mind. The real issue for us over the next 20, 30, 40 years is not jobs, it's wages. Can I repeat that? The real issue is not jobs, it is wages. We will get jobs back, but maybe we will get them back only by having the dollar drop relative to foreign currencies, or having so many people have to settle for new jobs that are paying less than their old jobs, or having wage givebacks to the employer, or something like that. The issue underlying everything else is the ability of individuals to add value to this increasingly integrated global economy, increasingly technologically driven global economy. German workers add considerable value. They are not getting good wages only because they have labor unions, that's part of it, but they're also adding substantial value because they are well educated. We are on the road to getting lower and lower wages because we are on the road to not being well educated. And that's a function of how we structure society. Yes.
Bob, hi. Catherine Cash. I'm here with Gus Newport. I may be a bit off base, but two things that recently in the news right now: the adulation of Steve Jobs and the performance of Apple, and this collapse of Solyndra here in Fremont. It's my understanding that most, if not all, of the Apple products were made in China. And now, again, we've got Solyndra collapsing and being blamed on advances in Chinese technology. Just wondered if you had any comments on either of those two companies.
Well, I don't really know enough about those two companies to give you any interesting or important insights. But I can say that all you have to do is look at the back of an iPad or an iPod, and you see designed in America, made in China. But what it doesn't say, it says made in China, but actually, if you look very, very closely, you see the innards are coming from Japan and Thailand and Vietnam and coming from all over. Some of them are designed all over, some of them are manufactured all over. They are assembled in China. But the point I wanted to make with you before is that assembly operation is becoming more and more technologically driven. And so if we think that the Chinese are sort of taking away all our jobs, we're not getting at the nub of the problem. Okay. Yes.
Hi. I'm in a political party, and I'm out of power right now. So in order to get back into power, I want to keep the economy in a funk by preventing stimulative measures, by blocking stimulative measures and framing the debates in terms of deficit reduction. What will you do against me?
You know, it's a very clever way. Well, I think you're a scoundrel. But it is an interesting thing. I often ask myself whether people who are focusing and framing the public debate around both long-term deficit reduction, and they're right about the long term. We do have to worry about the long term, but much of that is driven by healthcare costs, as I just said. Whether those people who are doing that are really driven by an ideological view of they just hate government, they want to shrink government, and if that's their view, they're entitled to it. But then I wonder whether some of them are being driven not so much by that ideological view, but by a desire to keep the economy bad, at least through 2012. And when I hear the leader of one of our major parties say that the number one objective of that party, the number one objective, given everything that's going on, all of the people unemployed, even healthcare, infant mortality, climate change, the wars, everything that is going on, the number one objective is to get rid of the president. I begin to become a little bit suspicious of everything I hear from that one party, but I'm not going to be partisan in this venue. Yes.
My name is Eileen. Thanks for your lecture. And I have two kind of questions about, you mentioned about technology as being one of the factors in this global economy, but I have another idea that I wanted to know what your perspective, because America is very famous on entertainment industry, and that's really globalized. And then to me, that is looking at like how much actors and actor get paid. And then the CEO of America, comparatively with the German CEO, which have a lower gap between the CEO and the workers. We have a very large gap between the American CEO and the workers. I think this is really a huge problem, and I want to know what you think. Actors and actors get paid a lot.
What do I think about the fact that CEOs are getting paid 320 times the pay of average workers? About 30 years ago, it was about 40 times the pay. 40 years ago, it was at about 30 times the pay. So that gap is growing dramatically. And you're right to begin the question with the entertainment industry, because those who rationalize CEO pay say, well, look at the entertainers, the great, Meryl Streeps and Tom Hanks and all of the wonderful entertainers, they're getting paid extraordinary sums. And look at the baseball players and the football players, all of them, those are getting $40 million, $50 million, $100 million contracts. Well, CEOs are certainly worth that much, aren't they? But I think the analogy breaks down because CEOs are being paid that much not because so many consumers love to watch CEOs in movies or on television. They're getting paid that much because basically the structure of CEO salaries has devolved to the point where the compensation committees on boards of directors hire outside consultants to see what other CEOs in the same industry or same size companies are being paid, and then come back to that board of directors and say, well, everybody else is being paid about $11 million a year, and so the discussion around the board says, well, we ought to pay more in order to ensure that we retain or get the very best CEO. And that ratcheting up effect is fundamental and everything that is going on. Institutional investors in this country, CalPERS and all the rest, ought to be taking a much more activist role in making sure that CEO pay is brought down to earth.
Yes, Professor. About 3 months ago, Times Magazine ran an article titled Rethinking Marx. I'm not going to paraphrase the article, it's very interesting. At the conclusion of the article, German Chancellor suggested that given the current economic crisis throughout the world, perhaps capitalist system need to be rethought, and this might not be the best system. About a month and a half ago, on the CNBC, where you appeared this morning, ran a poll. It was on the onset of all this social uprising during Gulf wars, etc. And as a result, they ran a poll asking people whether they believe, again, due to current economic condition and inequalities between super rich, super poor, that people think there might be a social revolution. 77% of respondents here in this country, obviously, said yes, they believe so. So my question to you is to organize people. People are smarter, people are well connected, smart mobs, etc. And given the onrush of this social revolution, do you believe, are we primed for a new social revolution? And if it is, what shape will it take, or could it take?
I doubt that we're going to have anything that resembles a social revolution in the United States. France goes on strike, and there are demonstrations. And even in Germany, occasionally you get demonstrations. Certainly in China, there are a lot of demonstrations and a lot of activity and tumult. Americans tend, at least in the past, we do get to a point. Vietnam was a very divisive issue for those of us who were here, and it really did. It was a kind of as close as we've come to a social revolution, but it's very hard to get to the tipping point, to the boiling point. I mean, we still cling to the notion in this country that we have a democracy and that we have social upward mobility. And as long as we have those two, I won't say mythologies because there's a lot to them, but as long as we have those two ideas in our head, it tends to deflate a lot of the anger. Many people whine all the time, because of my height and because I'm on television sometimes. Strangers come up to me in airports and wherever I am, and they start whining about the state of the country and the economy and politics, and they whine, and I look at them, and what I normally end up saying to them is, at the end of the whine, is, what are you doing about it? Because they're probably most of the time, doing nothing.
Perhaps I think it's your job.
We might get to a tipping point. But what I've said to a lot of wealthy individuals, when I do have any opportunity at all to talk to people who are in that upper 1%, I say this, not that you need to get active in terms of changing the structure and using your political influence in more positive ways just because you have to worry about a social revolution if you don't. No, that's not the argument I use. I say you will do better with a smaller percentage of a rapidly growing economy than you will do with a larger percentage of an economy that's dead in the water. The rising tide lifts all boats. The tide that's ebbing is beaching even the yachts. Now we have time in fact, we've run out of time. So I apologize. I don't want to keep anybody later, but let's have one more question. And this, I'm afraid, has to be the last. But I'd appreciate it if this could be a question that would enable me to wind up in a coherent way everything tonight, so that I can kind of leave people with an upbeat feeling, as well as a coherent message. So don't feel any pressure, but if you could do that, I would appreciate it.
I think I can do that.
Okay.
You have certainly pointed out we have a lot to whine about. I'm wondering what you think the role of public banking is in solving some of these problems. That's an upbeat question.
That wasn't exactly what I was seeking.
Answer your...
But it's a good question. Public banking, how can I integrate public banking? Well, public banking, in terms of being a vehicle through which, like the old savings and loan institutions, people would pool their savings and would thereby invest in their communities, invest in their states. We have state public banks, at least we're moving in that direction. That can be a very important vehicle for making investments and also making loans that are interrelated, integrated into the fabric of a regional economy. It's the way the old banks used to work. The problem is, well, now we have global banks that don't have any particular responsibility or dependence on any particular region. So their lending and their equity practices, their investments, are not designed to lift up an entire region or a state or a locale. So that notion that I'm giving you, I'm not putting a label of public bank, I'm giving you an idea. I'm not giving you an idea because you had the idea to begin with, but that notion is very important. And the way I'm going to link that to everything else I've said tonight is this. The big debate that I hope we have in this country in 2012, or if not in 2012, at least in the next few years, is a debate about the structure of our society, our economy, and our politics. Whether that debate takes the form of community banking or tax reform or financing of elections, what I hope is that we see, or any of the economic ills we've talked about tonight, or climate change, what I hope we understand and we keep very cognizant understanding of, and we hope other people understand, is the relationship between all of these different pieces of the pie. Too often, people get so intensely excited or in a kind of mode about one particular area, one particular issue, one particular thing, that they don't see the whole. We fragment ourselves. We don't really join together in a not social revolution, but a kind of a movement, a fundamental movement for the kind of social change that we can have in this society. Last point. The people who come up to me and whine these days are more cynical than I've ever heard in my entire life about public institutions and the capacity of our government and our institutions to do anything right. That cynicism is the greatest enemy we have, because that cynicism is an invitation to everyone else who doesn't believe that we can do anything to take the center stage. Do not succumb to cynicism. If you remember nothing else that I say, just remember that. Thank you.